There exists a threshold between waking and sleeping where the mystics have always dwelled, a liminal space where consciousness doesn't dissolve but transforms into something else entirely. Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Sufi master, known as the greatest master, understood this threshold not as a place of rest, but as a doorway to dimensions of awareness that most people only glimpse in fleeting moments before sleep swallows them whole. What if the exhaustion you feel upon waking isn't from sleeping too little, but from sleeping in a way that disconnects you from the very source of energy itself? The modern world has taught us to fear sleeplessness, to view it as a deficiency that must be corrected with 8 uninterrupted hours of unconsciousness. We collapse into our beds like stones, sinking into dark water, surrendering our awareness completely, and we call this rest. But Ibn Arabi spoke of something far more mysterious, a way of sleeping that doesn't extinguish the flame of consciousness, but allows it to burn differently, more subtly, touching realms that the waking mind cannot access. He described the night as a garment that conceals the seeker from the eyes of strangers, a sacred time when the soul can converse with dimensions beyond the material without any observer, because God has put sleep into the eyes of those who would disturb this intimate communion. Consider for a moment the quality of your own sleep. Do you close your eyes and simply cease to exist until morning? Or is there something happening in those dark hours, something you've been trained not to notice, not to cultivate? The Sufis recognize that sleep is not the opposite of wakefulness, but a different mode of being, one that can be entered with intention rather than surrendered to with complete oblivion. They understood that the body requires rest, yes, but the spirit requires something else entirely, a kind of vigilant receptivity that modern sleep has forgotten. Ibn Arabi wrote extensively about the people of the night, those spiritual practitioners who use the darkness not for unconsciousness but for a deeper form of consciousness. While others slept the heavy sleep of complete forgetfulness, these seekers entered a state where the boundaries between the material and immaterial worlds became permeable. They discovered that you don't need to sleep for 8 hours to wake refreshed if those hours are spent in a state of awareness that allows the soul to draw energy from sources beyond the physical body. This wasn't sleep deprivation as we understand it today, with its cascading health consequences and metabolic disruption. This was something else, a way of resting that simultaneously replenishes and awakens. Modern sleep science tells us that insufficient sleep increases energy expenditure, disrupts hormones, impairs cognition, and weakens the immune system. Researchers measure sleep stages, track REM cycles, and warn us about the dangers of chronic sleep deprivation. And they're not wrong. The body needs rest, needs the restoration that comes during deep sleep when oxidative stress is cleared from the brain and metabolic balance is restored. But what if there's a dimension to human rest that cannot be measured by EEG monitors and sleep trackers? What if Ibn Arabi's insights point to a way of sleeping that works with the body's need for restoration while simultaneously cultivating a quality of consciousness that transforms the very nature of fatigue itself? The mystic tradition speaks of stages of consciousness that most people only access accidentally during the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping. Ibn Arabi taught that this threshold could be deliberately inhabited, that a practitioner could learn to rest the body while keeping a subtle thread of awareness alive. This isn't the same as lucid dreaming, though it shares some qualities. It's more fundamental, a way of allowing the conscious mind to rest while the deeper aspects of consciousness remain active and receptive to what he called fresh inspiration and spiritual knowing that takes on different forms with each breath. Think about how you prepare for sleep. Most people carry the day's anxiety, the unresolved tensions, the racing thoughts directly into bed with them. They lie there replaying conversations, planning tomorrow, worrying about things beyond their control, and then wonder why they wake exhausted even after 7 or 8 hours of unconsciousness. Ibn Arabi understood that true rest begins before you close your eyes. It begins with a deliberate release, a conscious setting aside of everything that keeps you tethered to the surface level of awareness, where anxiety lives and energy drains away. The Sufi practice involves what they call dhikr, remembrance, a focused concentration that synchronizes mind, breath, and intention. Before sleep, this practice serves to quiet the mental chaos, to create a stillness that allows the transition into rest to become something sacred rather than something feared or resisted. It's not about forcing yourself to sleep less through willpower or stimulants. It's about fundamentally changing the quality of the sleep you do have so that even fewer hours become deeply restorative in ways that ordinary sleep never achieves. Modern science has discovered that sleep quality matters more than sleep quantity in many ways. Studies show that the timing and consolidation of deep sleep and REM sleep affect how rested you feel upon waking. When these sleep stages are fragmented or poorly timed, you can sleep for 8 hours and still wake exhausted. But when sleep is consolidated, when the transitions between stages flow naturally and in harmony with both homeostatic and circadian rhythms, even shorter sleep periods can leave you feeling refreshed. Ibn Arabi's teachings suggest that intention and awareness before sleep create the conditions for this kind of high-quality consolidated rest. But there's more to his teaching than sleep optimization. Ibn Arabi spoke of sleep as one of God's signs, a phenomenon that contains within it clues to the nature of consciousness itself. In Islamic tradition, sleep is sometimes referred to as a minor death, a daily dissolution of the ego that prefigures the greater dissolution to come. When you fall asleep with awareness of this, when you consciously release your grip on identity and allow yourself to dissolve, something profound happens. You're not just resting your body, you're practicing a kind of spiritual death and rebirth that transforms your relationship to energy itself. The mystics understood that energy doesn't come solely from food and rest, though these are important. Energy comes from alignment with something larger than the isolated self. When you sleep with the intention of connecting to this larger reality, call it God, call it the unified field of consciousness, call it whatever your worldview permits, you tap into sources of vitality that the purely materialistic view of sleep cannot explain. This is why the Sufis could maintain intense spiritual practices through the night, with only brief periods of rest and wake, more energized than people who slept twice as long. Ibn Arabi identified 4 cornerstones of the spiritual way: silence, solitude, hunger, and wakefulness. Note that wakefulness is included, not in opposition to rest, but as a quality that can be maintained even during sleep. This wakefulness isn't the hyper-alert state of anxiety or the artificial stimulation of caffeine. It's a subtle vigilance of the soul, a receptivity that remains active even as the body and surface mind surrender to rest. Cultivating this quality requires practice, but the rewards are profound. A way of resting that doesn't diminish consciousness but deepens it. Consider the phenomenon that mystics call muraqabah, often translated as meditation or contemplation. In this practice, the seeker sits in stillness and allows thoughts to gradually subside. Eventually, there's a drifting, an entry into a different dimension of consciousness. This drifting is distinguished from ordinary sleep because the soul doesn't descend into the lower realms of complete unconsciousness, but ascends or expands into subtler states. When this practice is integrated into the transition to sleep, when you allow yourself to drift in this way as you lie down for the night, sleep becomes something other than oblivion. The scientific research on polyphasic sleep, sleeping multiple times across a 24-hour period rather than in one long block, has shown mixed results. Some studies suggest that while sleep architecture can be maintained and total sleep time reduced, there are costs including decreased growth hormone, altered brain activity, and reduced cognitive performance in some domains. But these studies examine polyphasic sleep without the element that Ibn Arabi considered essential: the spiritual dimension, the intentional cultivation of awareness during the transition to and from sleep. They treat sleep purely as a biological process to be manipulated rather than a sacred threshold to be honored. What would happen if you approached sleep not as something to minimize or optimize purely for productivity, but as Ibn Arabi did, as an opportunity for the soul to be renewed, for consciousness to touch dimensions it cannot access during ordinary waking hours? The practice begins simply. Before sleep, you create a ritual of release. You consciously set aside the day's burdens, not by suppressing them, but by acknowledging them, and then choosing to let them rest while you rest. You turn your attention inward, perhaps focusing on your breath, perhaps on a word or phrase that has spiritual significance for you, perhaps simply on the sensation of your body preparing for sleep. As you lie there in the darkness, instead of fighting for unconsciousness or anxiously monitoring whether you're falling asleep quickly enough, you allow yourself to hover in that threshold state. You notice the way thoughts begin to take on a dreamlike quality, the way the boundaries of your identity start to soften, and instead of immediately plunging into complete unconsciousness, you maintain just a thread of awareness, a subtle witnessing presence that observes the transition. This isn't exhausting if done correctly. It's actually deeply restful because you're not trying to control or manipulate the process, just to remain gently aware of it. Ibn Arabi taught that in this liminal state, the soul can access what he called unveiling, direct perception of realities that are hidden during ordinary waking consciousness. These aren't hallucinations or fantasies, but encounters with dimensions of consciousness that are always present but usually obscured by the noise of the thinking mind. When you sleep with this quality of subtle awareness, your rest becomes nourishing in a way that goes beyond physical restoration. You wake not just with a rested body, but with something else. A sense of having touched something vast, of having drunk from a well that doesn't run dry. The modern epidemic of exhaustion isn't just about insufficient sleep, though that's certainly part of it. It's about a quality of disconnection, a way of living that treats consciousness as nothing more than brain activity, and the body as a machine that needs only fuel and maintenance. When you reduce sleep to a purely biological process, you miss the dimension that Ibn Arabi and the mystic traditions understood, that sleep is a gateway, and how you pass through that gateway determines not just how rested you feel, but who you become. The Sufis spoke of different levels of consciousness that most people only touch during sleep. The conscious mind is at rest during ordinary sleep, and in that rest, the soul can access what they called the imaginal realm, a dimension between pure spirit and pure matter. Through practice, a seeker can learn to maintain a degree of awareness while the soul travels in this realm, bringing back insights and inspiration that feel fresh and alive. This is the source of what Ibn Arabi called the renewal state, where neural connections formed by habitual thoughts and beliefs are dissolved and reformed, where the consciousness is literally renewed. Modern neuroscience has begun to recognize something similar in its study of sleep's role in memory consolidation and neural plasticity. During sleep, particularly during REM sleep, the brain processes and integrates experiences, strengthens some neural connections and weakens others. But the materialist framework of neuroscience cannot fully account for the subjective experience of waking transformed, of having accessed during the night something that feels like wisdom rather than just processed information. Ibn Arabi's framework offers a complementary understanding that during sleep, when the grip of the ego loosens, consciousness can expand beyond its ordinary boundaries and touch sources of knowing that transcend the individual brain. The practice of sleeping less while waking more energized isn't about forcing your body into unhealthy patterns or glorifying sleep deprivation. The health consequences of chronic sleep deprivation are real and serious: increased risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, impaired immune function, and cognitive decline. Ibn Arabi's teaching isn't a license to ignore the body's needs. Rather, it's an invitation to transform the quality of sleep so profoundly that less becomes sufficient, even abundant. This transformation requires a fundamental shift in how you understand energy itself. The conventional view is that energy comes from calories consumed and is depleted through activity, including the activity of wakefulness. Sleep conserves energy, allowing the body to restore what was depleted. This is true at one level, but Ibn Arabi points to another dimension: energy that comes from alignment, from connection to the source of all consciousness. When you sleep with awareness, when you use the night as a time of spiritual communion, rather than mere biological shutdown, you access this other source. Think about times you've woken feeling inexplicably energized despite little sleep, perhaps after a night of profound dreams, or when you fell asleep with a deep sense of peace, or when some creative insight was gestating in your unconscious. There's a quality to that waking that's different from the groggy, resistant waking after a night of restless, unconscious sleep. Ibn Arabi's practice aims to make this energized waking not an accident, but a cultivated skill. The key is in the transition moments, falling asleep and waking up. In Islamic tradition, there are specific prayers or phrases to say at these thresholds, acknowledging that sleep is a form of death and waking is a resurrection. This isn't mere poetic metaphor. When you approach these transitions with conscious awareness, you're training yourself to maintain a thread of consciousness through what would otherwise be complete dissolution. Over time, this practice changes sleep itself. Your sleep becomes more efficient, not in the mechanical sense of optimized sleep cycles, but in the deeper sense of being more nourishing to your entire being. You might still cycle through the same sleep stages that science has mapped: light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep. But your experience of those stages is transformed by the quality of awareness you bring to them. The soul doesn't simply sink into unconsciousness during deep sleep, but descends into a restful receptivity. During REM sleep, instead of being swept away by random dream imagery, there's a subtle witnessing that allows the symbolic language of dreams to become a form of communication rather than mere neural noise. Ibn Arabi described the night as a time when the veils between the visible and invisible worlds become thin. While the ordinary world sleeps, while the noise and distraction of daily life quiets, the soul has space to expand. But this expansion requires preparation. You cannot carry the day's anxieties, resentments, and obsessions into sleep and expect to access these deeper dimensions. The Sufis practiced a kind of conscious release, a deliberate setting aside of everything that binds consciousness to its most superficial levels. This release often involved what they called dhikr, the remembrance of the divine through focused repetition of sacred phrases or names. But the essence of the practice isn't in the specific words, it's in the quality of attention they cultivate. By focusing the mind on something beyond the ego's concerns, by synchronizing breath with intention, by allowing the heart to soften and open, the practitioner creates the conditions for a different kind of sleep. Not the collapse of exhaustion, not the unconscious shutdown of overwhelm, but a conscious yielding, a willing descent into mystery. What emerges from this practice is remarkable. The ability to rest deeply in shorter periods, to wake with a sense of vitality that doesn't depend solely on sleep duration. But more than that, there's a transformation in the relationship to fatigue itself. Ordinary tiredness is often existential as much as physical, a weariness that comes from feeling disconnected from the relentless expenditure of energy without replenishment from deeper sources. When you begin to sleep, as Ibn Arabi teaches, when rest becomes a spiritual practice rather than just a biological necessity, that existential fatigue begins to dissolve. You start to notice that energy isn't something you simply have or don't have based on sleep and food. Energy is also something that flows through you when you're aligned with sources beyond the individual self. The Sufis describe this as being in a state of dhikr, with the same dhikr that you yourself are. A level of awareness where the separation between the one remembering and what is remembered dissolves. In this state, action requires less effort because it's not powered solely by individual will, but by something vaster flowing through. This isn't magical thinking or wishful spirituality. It's a recognition of something that science is only beginning to understand, that consciousness is not confined to the brain, that states of coherence and alignment have measurable effects on energy, health, and performance. When brain coherence increases, when neural networks synchronize, the system operates more efficiently. When this synchronization extends beyond the brain to include the heart and the entire body, when it even extends beyond the body to include a sense of connection to something larger, the effects are profound. Ibn Arabi taught that every moment of awareness should bring with it a sense of renewal, what he called fresh inspiration that changes with each breath. If your spiritual knowing doesn't transform moment to moment, if it becomes static and fixed, it can't be relied upon. This principle applies to sleep as well. Each night is an opportunity for renewal, not just physiological restoration, but a fundamental refreshing of consciousness itself. When you approach sleep this way, when you use it as Ibn Arabi suggests, you're not just resting, you're being remade. The practice requires patience and gentleness with yourself. You cannot force this kind of aware sleep to happen through effort or willpower. It emerges from a quality of surrender, a willingness to release control while maintaining a subtle vigilance. This paradox is at the heart of Sufi practice. To act without acting, to be present without forcing presence, to sleep while remaining awake in the deepest sense. Start simply tonight if you wish. As you prepare for sleep, take a few moments to consciously release the day. Notice the anxieties and tensions you're carrying, and choose to set them down, not by repressing them, but by acknowledging that they need not follow you into sleep. Focus on your breath, allowing it to slow and deepen naturally. You might repeat a phrase that has meaning for you, or simply rest your attention on the sensation of breathing. The specific technique matters less than the quality of gentle, focused awareness you bring to it. As you lie down, instead of trying to fall asleep quickly, allow yourself to be interested in the transition. Notice how thoughts begin to drift, how the boundary between waking and dreaming starts to blur. Don't try to control this. Just observe it with gentle curiosity. If you find yourself thinking about tomorrow or replaying the day, notice that too, and gently return your attention to the present moment, to the sensation of your body resting, to the rhythm of your breath. You may fall asleep quickly or slowly. This isn't the point. The point is cultivating a quality of awareness that begins to permeate even your sleep. Over time, with patient practice, you'll notice changes. Your sleep may feel different, richer somehow, even if you can't articulate exactly how. You might begin to remember more dreams, or to wake with insights that feel like they came from somewhere beyond your ordinary thinking. Most significantly, you may find that you need less sleep to feel truly rested. Not because you're depriving yourself, but because the sleep you're getting has become profoundly nourishing. This practice doesn't replace the need for adequate sleep, especially at the beginning. Your body still requires rest, still needs the restoration that comes during deep sleep stages. But as the practice deepens, as you become more skilled at maintaining awareness through the threshold of sleep, the quality of your rest transforms. What once required 8 hours might be accomplished in 6 or 7, not through deprivation, but through a fundamental shift in how sleep functions for you. Ibn Arabi spoke of sleep as a garment, something that covers and protects while you engage in what he called intimate conversation with the source of all being. Hidden from the eyes of the world, concealed in darkness, the soul can open to dimensions of reality that are always present, but usually obscured by the noise of ordinary consciousness. This isn't escapism or withdrawal from the world. It's a way of drawing from deeper wells so that your engagement with the world becomes more vital, more present, more alive. The exhaustion that so many people feel in the modern world isn't just about insufficient sleep or poor sleep hygiene, though these contribute. It's about a disconnection from sources of meaning and vitality that transcend the individual self. When life is reduced to a series of tasks to accomplish, obligations to fulfill, stimulations to consume, energy drains away no matter how much you sleep. But when even sleep becomes a practice of connection, of touching something vaster than your isolated existence, energy begins to flow from unexpected sources. The Sufis understood that wakefulness and sleep aren't truly opposites, but different modes of consciousness, each with its own gifts and possibilities. Wakefulness allows engagement with the material world, the realm of action and relationship. Sleep allows the soul to withdraw from that engagement and touch realities that aren't accessible through sensory perception. But in both states, awareness can be maintained, not the narrow, controlling awareness of the ego, but the spacious, receptive awareness that Ibn Arabi called unveiling. When you cultivate this awareness in sleep, something remarkable happens to waking life as well. The sharp division between sleeping and waking begins to soften. You bring to your waking hours some of the receptivity and openness that you've cultivated during sleep, and you bring to sleep some of the consciousness that usually only operates during waking. This isn't about blurring the distinction unhealthily. You still sleep and you still wake, but about enriching both states with qualities they usually lack. Modern research on consciousness is beginning to recognize that awareness exists on a spectrum, that there are states between full waking consciousness and complete unconsciousness that have their own unique qualities. Meditation studies show that practitioners can maintain awareness during what appears from the outside to be deep relaxation or even sleep. The neural signatures of these states differ from both ordinary waking and ordinary sleep, suggesting genuinely different modes of consciousness. Ibn Arabi's teachings provide a framework for understanding and cultivating these states, not just during meditation but during the sleep that occupies a third of every life. The invitation here isn't to sleep less for the sake of productivity or achievement, That approach only leads to the well-documented consequences of sleep deprivation: impaired health, decreased cognitive function, emotional instability. The invitation is to transform sleep itself, to approach it as the mystics did, as a sacred threshold rather than mere unconsciousness. When sleep becomes a spiritual practice, when you learn to rest while maintaining a subtle thread of awareness, the need for excessive sleep often diminishes naturally, not through force, but through a fundamental shift in how rest nourishes you. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It requires patient practice, a willingness to experiment, and most importantly, a letting go of the desperate need to control and optimize every aspect of life. The modern obsession with sleep tracking and optimization can actually interfere with the deeper quality of rest that Ibn Arabi describes. When you're constantly monitoring and measuring your sleep, you're approaching it with the same anxious, controlling mind that exhausts you during waking hours. True rest requires a quality of surrender that data-driven optimization cannot provide. Ibn Arabi's path is one of submission in the deepest sense, not passive acceptance, but active yielding to something greater than the isolated self. In sleep, this yielding becomes literal. You release your grip on identity, on control, on the small self's endless concerns. And in that release, if you've prepared correctly, if you've cultivated the right quality of awareness, you don't simply disappear into oblivion. Instead, you expand into connection with dimensions of reality that the waking mind cannot grasp. This is the secret that the mystics have always known, that energy doesn't come primarily from food and rest, though these are important. Energy comes from alignment, from coherence, from connection to sources that transcend the individual organism. When you sleep in a way that deepens this connection rather than severing it, when you use the night for spiritual communion rather than mere biological shutdown, you wake transformed, not just rested, but renewed in a way that goes beyond physical restoration. The practice asks you to approach sleep with reverence, with the understanding that these hours of darkness are not dead time to be minimized, but sacred time to be honored. Each night is an opportunity to die to the small self and be reborn to something vaster. Each morning is a resurrection, a return to the world of form and action, carrying with you something of the formless realm you touched in sleep. When you understand this, when you practice this, sleep becomes not a retreat from life, but a deepening into life's most profound dimensions. There's a quality of energy that comes from this practice that's different from the energy of caffeine or stimulation, different even from the energy of a good night's conventional sleep. It's a vitality that comes from touching the source, from drinking directly from the well that never runs dry. The Sufis called this baraka, blessing, spiritual power, a quality of grace that flows through those who've aligned themselves with the divine. You might call it something else, name it according to your own understanding, but the reality remains there are sources of energy that transcend the purely physical, and sleep practiced consciously can open you to these sources. Ibn Arabi taught that every breath, every moment, should bring fresh knowing, a renewed encounter with reality. Sleep is no exception. Each night offers the possibility of touching something vast, of being renewed not just physically, but in the deepest dimensions of your being. But this possibility can only be realized if you approach sleep with consciousness, with intention, with the understanding that the threshold between waking and sleeping is a doorway to dimensions that most people never explore. The modern epidemic of exhaustion will not be solved by more sleep alone, though adequate rest is essential. It will be solved by reconnecting to dimensions of meaning and vitality that our materialistic culture has forgotten. Ibn Arabi's teachings on sleep offer one path to this reconnection, a way of using the night not to escape from life, but to touch its deepest sources. When you sleep this way, when you rest with awareness, you wake not just with energy, but with something more precious, a sense of being connected to something that doesn't drain away, a vitality that comes from beyond the small self. Consider tonight the quality of awareness you bring to your sleep. Will you collapse into unconsciousness, carrying all the day's burdens with you into oblivion? Or will you pause at the threshold, release what needs to be released, and enter sleep as the mystics did, consciously, reverently, with the understanding that you're crossing into sacred territory? The choice is yours, and it's a choice you can make every night. Each time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, awareness over oblivion, you're training yourself in a way of being that transforms not just sleep, but waking life as well. Ibn Arabi wrote that the people of the night delight in their nocturnal seclusion with the beloved, conversing intimately without any observer. This is the possibility that sleep offers, a time of intimacy with the deepest reality, hidden from the world's eyes, protected by the garment of darkness. But this intimacy requires presence, requires the cultivation of awareness even as the body rests. It requires practice, patience, and a willingness to approach sleep as something more than mere unconsciousness. The reward for this practice is profound, not just the ability to sleep less while waking more energized, though that's part of it. More importantly, you discover a way of resting that nourishes not just the body but the soul, that connects you to sources of vitality that don't deplete, that transforms your relationship to exhaustion itself. You learn that energy isn't something you simply have or lack based on sleep and food, but something that flows when you're aligned with dimensions of reality beyond the material. In the end, Ibn Arabi's teaching on sleep is really a teaching on consciousness, on the possibility of maintaining awareness through all states, of touching in the darkness what cannot be grasped in the light, of dying each night and being reborn each morning transformed. This is the ancient wisdom that the modern world has forgotten in its obsession with productivity and optimization. Sleep is not time to be minimized or even just optimized. It's a doorway to dimensions of reality that are always present but usually hidden, a sacred threshold that offers renewal beyond the merely physical. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember this: you're not just shutting down for maintenance and repair. You're approaching a threshold that mystics have always honored, a doorway between worlds. How you cross that threshold, the quality of awareness you bring to it, determines not just how rested you'll feel tomorrow, but who you're becoming through this daily practice of dying and being reborn. Choose consciousness, choose presence, choose to sleep as the Sufis slept, with awareness that even in darkness, even in rest, the soul can touch what is most real, most vital, most alive.